Oh, good morning. Good morning. It's Palm Sunday, and we're almost to Easter. We're not quite there, but we're almost there. It's Palm Sunday. Our study today is not about the triumphal entry, which is another name for Palm Sunday, or the experience of Jesus riding the donkey into the city of Jerusalem and to the temple. But we're looking at the Passover. The Passover followed that during that week called Holy Week, on the night before Good Friday. And we're going to look at the Passover a little bit this week. Now, I mentioned all that because we're doing a Passover meal, often called a Seder meal, on this coming Thursday. And it's a regular meal with various ingredients, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But I mention it because we're going to try to videotape that. And so that you can see it happening. We have about 20 people that will be here sharing the meal, and that takes a while. It'll take an hour or so to do the Seder meal this Thursday. But that's what we're looking at today in our Bible study, is the Passover. So I'm going to give you a bit of history in it. It's in all four gospel accounts. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar accounts, and they talk about it, and they particularly will talk about the bread and the cup. You see, because we don't call it Passover now, but we have names for it. We may call it the Lord's Supper. We may even speak of it as the Last Supper. We may call it communion, which is how it's called in many of our churches. In some churches it's called Eucharist, which means the Thanksgiving, and in some churches they call it the table, the Lord's table. So there are different names for it, but it's based in the Passover meal. Now the Passover meal was 1,500 years old at the time of Jesus. It goes back beyond the time of the kings, beyond David, beyond Saul. It goes back to the time of Moses. That's when the Passover began. Now, you have to remember that there was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had a son named Joseph and other brothers and sisters, and they had gone down to Egypt. Now, that was almost in the year 2,000 years before the time of Christ. We're 2,000 years after the time of Christ. That was 2,000 years before the time of Christ. And they went down into Egypt, and Joseph there settled his family in Egypt, in the delta of the Nile, in the area called Goshen. And they prospered there. They were farmers, shepherds, they prospered there. But in time, the Pharaoh that was there at the time of Joseph and his family were overthrown. A new dynasty, a new realm of pharaohs began. And a pharaoh is just a kind of another word for king. He's the king of Egypt. He came in and he got kind of concerned about all these Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the Israelites. And so he began to restrict their freedoms until finally they were slaves. And they were slaves for almost about 400 years. And then God told Moses, you go down and lead my people out of Egypt, and I'm going to bring them back into this land which was known then as Canaan, known sometimes as Philistia, sometimes known as Palestine, which is another word that we get from Philistine. So Moses goes down and he tells Pharaoh, now he'd been raised in Pharaoh's court by Pharaoh's daughter, and it wasn't the Pharaoh that raised him that was on the throne now, it was his son, which would have been like Moses' brother in the court. But he's on the throne now, and Moses comes to him and says, you've got to let my people go out to worship. And Pharaoh says, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to let slaves go. So it ends up that there's 10 plagues. The first one is the river of Nile turns to blood. And we can't explain it. It may be literal blood. It may be a form of an organism that lived in the Nile and turned the waters red. We don't know what it was, but there were flies, there were gnats, there were boils, there was hail. There were all kinds of plagues. Darkness even was a plague that happened. We think it might have been an eclipse. We're not sure of all of that stuff. How God uses things, we don't know. We just know there were 10 plagues, and they were a trial to the Egyptians as well as a trial to the Hebrews in many of them. the final plague was what we call the Passover or the angel of death. And that's where Moses said to Pharaoh, look, unless people put blood on the doorposts and on the lintel of their doors and stay inside on this night, the firstborn of everything, cattle, people, will die. And Pharaoh, of course, he's going to be tough and not do that. And Moses said to the Hebrew people, you must take a lamb and kill it and put the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel. And then you're going to bake bread that doesn't have any yeast or leaven in it. So it's going to be flat. It's not going to rise because it takes time to rise. And he said, we don't have time. You're going to eat it standing because we don't have time to be relaxed. So you're going to eat it standing, and you're going to eat the lamb. Roast the lamb after you've put the blood on the doorpost. Roast it whole, and basically the meal was going to be lamb and matzah, or a cracker-like substance. And so they fixed that. And during the night, now you may have seen the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston in it and all of that, which is theatrical. We don't know how it happened, but in the movie it shows darkness kind of creeping over the earth, and where that darkness pervades a room, that's like the angel of death. Now, anybody who went out, they're firstborn, not necessarily them, but if they were a firstborn, they died as they went out. So that's the last of the plagues, and Pharaoh sends word for the Hebrew people, get out of my land, get out of my land. And so they go out, they're dressed, they take their cattle, they take what they have, and they head towards the Red Sea. And then the story continues that Pharaoh changes his mind and comes after them. And God parts the waters of the Red Sea, they cross over into the Sinai Peninsula, and when Pharaoh's army tries to come, God lets the waters come back and they're drowned. Now that's a quick history of where the Passover came from. While the people were wandering in the wilderness, they did not observe the Passover. When they came into the land, after 40 years of wandering, then they celebrated the Passover again. Now that was celebrated all the way down through history. And you find that even when they were taken into captivity, about 500 years before the time of Jesus, almost 1,000 years after Moses had led them out, when they came back from captivity, they celebrated the Passover again. So that there were times when it didn't happen, but there were times when God said, you celebrate that Passover. And it's still celebrated to this day. This coming Saturday, the Jewish people will observe Passover. And we do it a little bit different than they do it, but very, very similar to that's how they did it and how Jesus did it. And so he observed more than one Passover. It talks about him coming into the city of Jerusalem to observe Passover at other times. And today, even today, Jewish people in our area who will observe Passover will conclude the Passover by saying, next year, Jerusalem. That's the great hope of the Jewish people, is to at least once in their lifetime experience Passover in the city of Jerusalem. Now, that's what Jesus was doing when he came down on that last trip from Galilee to Judea and to the city of Jerusalem, was to come and celebrate the Passover. And then, of course, the next day he would be crucified, and then 3 days later he would rise from the dead. Now, it comes that he rode into the city on Palm Sunday. He comes into the city a number of times during the week to teach in the temple. And then he meets with his disciples as they're coming into the city from Mount Olive. And he sends two of them into the city to find a man carrying a jar on his head, a water jar on his head. Now, that wasn't done. Now, you can check this at each of the gospel accounts. You'll find it in Matthew 26, you'll find it in Mark 11, you find it in Luke, I think it's 22, the Passover. John has it, but John doesn't talk as much about what happened as what Jesus taught. So where in Matthew, Mark, and Luke it takes about a chapter, in John it's 4 chapters, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 5 chapters. And John doesn't mention the bread, he doesn't mention the cup, he mentions about the washing of the disciples' feet. in there. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't mention the washing of the feet, but they do talk about the bread, and they talk about the cup. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments. Jesus sent the two disciples in to say, talk to this man and say, where will our master keep the Passover? And he'll lead you to a large upper room furnished. Now the upper room was a guest chamber on top of a house. Some houses it was very small. It would be smaller than this room that we're in here. In many houses, it was a very small room. In some houses, it was bigger. The house where they followed this man to was probably a third bigger than this room anyway, that they were gathered in. And there would be a low table, and there would be mats, because they would recline. They wouldn't sit in chairs. Now, if you've seen pictures or statues of the Last Supper, you see chairs many times, and that would be how they picture them as sitting. But that wasn't how they did it in Bible times. They would recline, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that Jesus reclined with his disciples. Now, they would lay down with their feet out like the spokes of a wheel from the hub, and the table would be in their center, and they would draw from that table. And so they would lay next to each other. Now, we know that Judas was on the right-hand side of Jesus, and John was on the left-hand side. He would, in other words, Jesus' back would have been to John. Jesus would have faced the back of Judas. And then the other disciples were around that table. Some say it was a U-shaped. We're not sure just what the shape of the table was. But they would gather around that, and food was provided. U-shape is easier to fill the cups if the waiter or the helper came in, because there's 4 different cups of wine that are drunk during the Seder meal, and different breads. So they would come in. But they would find this room prepared. Now, what they had to do was go to the temple and buy a lamb and have it slaughtered so they could bring it back and cook it. Again, you remember on Palm Sunday, which would be tomorrow, Jesus rode into the city, and he went into the temple, and there were the money changers and the sellers of the animals. Those animals were sold for the people to make sacrifice, because it had to be a perfect animal. And so they would go to the temple, because they probably weren't bringing any lambs with them from Galilee. They would go and buy a lamb, and then they would have the priest sacrifice it. They would bring it back and roast it in preparation. They would also fix bread, matzah bread. Now, they might have to cook it themselves, but they could also go to a bakery and get the flatbread. It would look like crackers. Kind of thick crackers, but it'd be flat. And it'd be about that size, more like a pancake, or even the dough of a pizza bread that they would be. And they would bring back a stack of them so that they'd all have some. That would be matzah. But then they would chop up apples, dates, nuts, and figs, and add wine to it, and they'd make a thing called harasheth, and that was mortar. And that was part of it. And then they would get bitter herbs, and they would bring that in, and they would have that on the table. And they would get some leafy green vegetables, and they would have salt water, and then they would have the wine that they would buy, or grape juice as it might be, and that would be a part of it. And so they would get all that ready for Jesus for his meal. And make sure it was ready. Now, we think it was at John Mark's house that this took place. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the fact that the man was carrying the jug of water, the fact that Jesus had probably made the arrangements ahead of time so that it could happen. And then he comes in with his disciples to share that meal. And they sit down at the meal. I'm not going to go into all that's part of that meal, but they would be a blessing, a kiddush, a consecration of the evening, lighting of the candles, and then there would be a washing of the hands. Now, there's 2 washings of the hands that happen. On one of those, it's likely that Jesus didn't wash his hands, but took the basin and went around and washed the disciples' feet instead. And Peter protested. He said, "You're not going to do that." But Jesus said, "You have to let me do that." So we're not sure when that happened, but that could have been that time. We know that then they drank a cup. And then Jesus broke the bread. Now there's 3 stacks of bread. We'll have 3, not 3 stacks, but we'll have 3 loaves together. And we know that they took that middle one and they would break it. And then Jesus would say, "This is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate in Egypt." Now that's a very similar statement to "This is my body." So could that have been when he took the bread, broke it, blessed it, gave it to his disciples, and instead of saying "This is the bread of affliction," he might well have said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Take and eat this." And he would have passed it around for them to eat. That's one possibility. Then there would be some singing. There would be some questions that are asked, and again, we'll have those in the video. And then there would be the meal. But before they ate the meal, they would eat the horseradish or the bitter herbs, because it reminded them of how bitter slavery was in Egypt. And that's what it is. It's a retelling of that. And there's a time when they put drops of wine on their plate, 10 drops, to remind them of the suffering of the Egyptians. Not just their suffering, but the suffering of the Egyptians, which is a good thing for us to remember, that sometimes our enemies we need to pray for and to bless them. Well, anyway, in the Bible, as we read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it says after the supper, he took the cup. Now, there's 2 cups that are drunk during the supper. There are 2 that are drunk after the supper. Which one was it? It's hard to say. Paul talks about the Last Supper too, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and 11. And he makes this statement. He says, "The cup of blessing, which we bless, is it not a participation in the Lord?" That's an interesting statement, because the 3rd cup was called the cup of blessing in the Passover meal, the 3rd cup. So that may well have been the cup, because it was after the meal, things were relaxed, they were just chatting, and Jesus picks up the cup, and he says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." Now, some people think, and with good reasoning, that it wasn't that cup which Jesus blessed and gave to, but it was the 4th cup, which was called the cup of Elijah. And that was the cup which he was saying, Elijah has come. Now, in the Jewish Passover to this day, they leave an empty seat and a plate set for somebody who's not there. And it's called the plate of Elijah. And at that point, they have a child go and open the door and invite Elijah to come. But you remember, Jesus said, Elijah has already come. And it may be that 4th cup was when Jesus said, "This is the new covenant. The Elijah has come, and we are in a new realm." And then Jesus said, "I will not drink of the cup again." Now, that would indicate almost it has to be the 4th cup, because he said, "I won't drink of the cup again until I drink it in the kingdom anew." So we'll look at those possibilities as we share the Passover on Thursday night. And then it says they sang a hymn and they went out. There's a bunch of hymns. We sing at least 5 hymns in the Passover meal. They're celebration hymns. They're celebrating God's goodness in delivering his people and promising to give them. So they celebrate the promise that God said, "I am going away, but I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." That's a great promise, and that's worthy of singing. Well, that's a little bit of what the Passover is about. Very quick summary of it, but it's a great word of hope for us as Christians. That's why we do it in remembrance of Jesus. Take the bread, take the cup, in remembrance of him. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your goodness to us this day. Thank you for the promise of deliverance in our lives, that you promise to free us from the burden and the guilt of sin. And you celebrate that in passing over and receiving us. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we'll talk about his resurrection next week.